Welcome back to Unbiased, your favorite source of unbiased news and legal analysis. Welcome back to Unbiased Politics. Today is Tuesday, September 23rd. Let's talk about some news. Starting with a Jimmy Kimmel update. Disney announced yesterday that Jimmy Kimmel Live will return to the air tonight, Tuesday, September 23rd, after being preempted indefinitely last week. In its statement, Disney said, quote, "Last Wednesday, we made the decision to suspend production on the show to avoid further inflaming a tense situation at an emotional moment for our country. It is a decision we made because we felt some of the comments were ill-timed and thus insensitive. We have spent the last days having thoughtful conversations with Jimmy, and after those conversations, we reached the decision to return the show on Tuesday." End quote. A source familiar with Kimmel's plans did tell CNN that Kimmel is planning to address this situation in his monologue tonight, so we will see what happens there. Now, in case you haven't caught last Thursday's episode, I will quickly try to catch everyone up to speed. Basically, last Monday, in Kimmel's opening monologue of his show, he said, quote, "We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anyone other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it." End quote. On Wednesday, FCC Chair Brendan Carr went on a podcast and basically said that licensed broadcasters, so the ones that are, running these shows on local affiliate stations, need to start pushing back on companies like Disney and ABC and start talking to them about the possibility of preempting shows, since they are the ones, these broadcast companies, they are the ones running the risk of losing their broadcast licenses by continuing to run content that is considered to be news distortion. Carr also said at one point in that interview, quote, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct and take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead." End quote. So just to kind of touch on the dynamics there, we have production companies like Disney, Warner Brothers, Universal, etc., that actually produce shows and movies. Then those shows and movies run on national broadcast networks like ABC, Fox, CBS, and NBC. For example, Jimmy Kimmel's show is produced by a few different production companies, but it's broadcast nationally on ABC. Then you have private companies that own broadcast affiliate stations. So take Sinclair and Nexstar. Sinclair and Nexstar are private companies that own local TV stations across the country. So a local ABC affiliate in Des Moines, Iowa, or Austin, Texas might not be owned by ABC or its parent company. Instead, it might be owned by Nexstar or Sinclair. In fact, Nexstar and Sinclair own about 30 to 35 ABC affiliate stations each. ABC runs on more than 200 stations across the country, but ABC actually only owns 8 of those stations itself. The rest are owned by private companies. Now, the FCC does not have control over production companies or national broadcast networks, so it doesn't have the ability to regulate Disney or ABC. What FCC does regulate are the local broadcast stations like Sinclair and Nexstar, and this is because the FCC grants these local broadcast stations licenses to use the public airwaves. Consequently, the FCC also has the power to revoke those licenses if local broadcast stations violate federal regulations. So that's how the FCC plays into all of this, and that's what Carr was referring to when he said we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC. So within hours of that interview, Carr's podcast interview going live, Nexstar and Sinclair went ahead and announced that they were preempting Kimmel's show. What that meant is that Kimmel would not air on roughly 65 ABC affiliate stations across the country. Disney and ABC then followed suit because if the show wasn't going to run on all of those stations, the show was likely going to operate at a loss. Importantly, Disney, ABC, Sinclair, and Nexstar all said that the decision to pull Kimmel's show was their decision and their decision only, that the government played no role in that decision. Despite that, though, there's still a whole First Amendment discussion that had to be had, and I included that discussion in Thursday's episode if you're interested in hearing it. I don't necessarily want to rehash it all now because I did go into pretty good detail in that episode. What I will say now that Kimmel is back on the air is this. Whether this whole debacle rises to a First Amendment violation will depend on what the government decides to do from here. Nexstar and Sinclair have both said that they will continue to preempt Kimmel's show despite its return to ABC tonight, though Sinclair said that its discussions with ABC are ongoing. So for now, Nexstar and Sinclair are still in the FCC's good graces. If one of them decides to run the show again, we'd have to see if the FCC decided to take any regulatory action and what that regulatory action would look like before we can start talking about any potential First Amendment violations. Because remember, the FCC cannot take regulatory action against Disney or ABC, only private broadcast companies like Sinclair and Nexstar. Okay, moving on. Over the weekend, President Trump announced a new $100,000 fee for H-1B visas. Here's what we know. First, what is an H-1B visa? An H-1B visa is a temporary work visa in the United States that allows U.S. employers, U.S. companies, to hire foreign workers in specialty occupations. These are jobs that usually require at least a bachelor's degree or higher in a specific field. Most commonly, these H-1B visas are used for technology jobs, engineering, finance, business analysis, medicine, healthcare, university research, things like that, though the technology and IT industries employ the largest share of H-1B holders. So it works like this. An American company will sponsor a worker. A person cannot just apply for an H-1B visa on their own. They have to be sponsored by an American company, and it's that American company that submits the visa application on the individual's behalf. If that visa is granted, it's typically granted for 3 years. There is a possibility of an extension up to a maximum of 6 years. Once that visa expires, the visa holder has to either transition to a different visa category, if applicable, or leave the United States. Importantly, H-1B workers have to be paid the same or higher than market salaries to avoid undercutting American workers. There's also an annual cap of $85,000 on new H-1B visas. So this includes 65 general visas each year and then 20,000 visas for workers with advanced degrees. It's also worth noting that demand is so high for these visas that the government currently runs a lottery system to decide who gets chosen. So knowing that, here's what we know about the fee. First and foremost, the new fee will be paid by the American companies who choose to sponsor foreign employees. This fee is not paid by the individual. So if Apple wants to submit H-1B applications for 10,000, foreign employees, it would have to pay the government $100,000 for each of those applications that it submits. The new fee only applies to H-1B visa applications that were submitted beginning yesterday. So applications submitted before yesterday are not subject to that $100,000 payment. And visa renewals will not be subject to the fee either. It only applies to applications submitted yesterday onward. Also, it's a one-time fee. So let's say Apple pays the $100,000 for the 10,000 H-1B visa applications. Let's say the government accepts 3,000 of those applications. Apple won't have to pay the $100,000 fee when those 3,000 visas are up for renewal. It's just a one-time fee at the time of submitting the application. The fee will last 12 months unless extended, and it applies only to H-1B visas. So it doesn't apply to any other visa category. It doesn't apply to student visas. It doesn't apply to tourist visas. This is just for H-1B visas. The proclamation also specifies that this fee will not apply when the Secretary of Homeland Security determines that hiring certain non-immigrant workers serves the national interest or does not threaten U.S. welfare or security. The proclamation reads in part, quote, "The H-1B non-immigrant visa program was created to bring temporary workers into the United States to perform additive, high-skilled functions, but it has been deliberately exploited to replace rather than supplement American workers with lower-paid, lower-skilled labor. The large-scale replacement of American workers through systemic abuse of the program has undermined both our economic and national security. End quote. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick similarly said, quote, "The whole idea is no more will these big tech companies or other companies train foreign workers. They have to pay the government $100,000, then they have to pay the employee. So it's not just economic. If you're going to train somebody, you're going to train one of the recent graduates from one of the great universities across our land." End quote. In other words, what he's saying is the goal is to either make these big tech companies pay up and create revenue for the government, or hiring foreign workers will be too expensive for them and they'll have to hire Americans instead. Currently, companies in the tech space will rely on these H-1B visas to recruit foreign workers and use it sort of as a pipeline instead of hiring American workers. But with the new fee, maintaining that practice becomes quite expensive. So the point is to make hiring foreign workers financially unattractive and therefore promote the U.S. workforce. Now, of course, there's arguments on both sides of this. Supporters of the fee argue that companies abuse H-1B visas to hire cheaper foreign labor, which depresses American wages, especially in tech. Supporters also argue that this fee will cause these companies to actually invest in the American workforce rather than foreign workers who eventually just end up leaving the United States and taking their skills and knowledge that they've learned with them. Opponents, on the other hand, argue that there's a talent shortage in the United States, especially when it comes to the tech, medical, and engineering fields, and that these H-1B visas fill the gap for American companies. Opponents also argue that immigrants on H-1B visas have either founded or contributed to many major tech companies like Google and Intel, and restricting them could hurt U.S. innovation. Some Republican critics include Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, who see these H-1B visas as a means of brain gain. Now, brain gain is a phrase that's used to describe the strengthening of a country's economy through the attraction of highly skilled foreign workers. So after the announcement of the new fee, Ramaswamy posted on X, quote, "A culture that celebrates the prom queen over the math Olympiad champion or the jock over the valedictorian will not produce the best engineers." End quote. So the arguments on both sides of the issue basically boil down to protection of U.S. workers versus talent shortage and innovation. As far as the legal basis goes, the proclamation cites two sections in the Immigration and Nationality Act as the legal basis for restricting the entry of certain H-1B applicants. Specifically, these sections are 212F and 215A. Section 212F says that whenever a president finds that the entry of any aliens or any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, the president can issue a proclamation which suspends the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens. So that's the one section. The other relevant section, 215A, generally just gives the president the ability to prescribe rules for entry into the United States. Now, we could see this new fee challenged in the courts. Basically, opponents would argue that individuals on H-1B visas are not, quote unquote, detrimental to the interests of the United States, whereas the administration would argue the opposite of that. Let's take our first break here. When we come back, we'll talk about this new Pentagon press policy. We'll also talk about the administration's Tylenol announcement and a few more stories. Welcome back. At the end of last week, the Pentagon enacted a new press policy that requires reporters to get all information cleared by the department before publishing that information. This new policy was outlined in a memo that circulated to the press on Friday. And one section of the memo has been particularly controversial. So the section reads in part, quote, "The Department of War remains committed to transparency to promote accountability and public trust. However, Department of War information must be approved for public release by an appropriate authorizing official before it's released, even if it's unclassified." End quote. The document goes on to say that failure to follow this policy can lead to loss of press credentials, restricted access within the building or removal of Pentagon access entirely. On Friday, Secretary Hegseth posted on X, quote, "The quote-unquote press does not run the Pentagon. The people do. The press is no longer allowed to roam the halls of a secure facility, wear a badge and follow the rules, or go home," end quote. In response to this policy change, the National Press Club, which is basically a club for journalists, said in a statement, quote, "The Pentagon is now demanding that journalists sign a pledge not to obtain or report any information, even if it's unclassified, unless it has been expressly authorized by the government. This is a direct assault on independent journalism at the very place where independent scrutiny matters most, the U.S. military." End quote. The press release from the National Press Club goes on to say, quote, "If the news about our military must first be approved by the government, then the public is no longer getting independent reporting. It is getting only what officials want them to see. That should alarm every American." End quote. So naturally, this new policy has sparked debate over whether these kinds of restrictions on the press are lawful and or constitutional. And as far as legal authority goes, the memo cites the Atomic Energy Act as well as 2 executive orders that discuss classified and controlled unclassified national security information. So the memo says, quote, "The Department of War must safeguard classified national security information in accordance with Executive Order 13526 and the Atomic Energy Act, and information designated as controlled unclassified information in accordance with Executive Order 13556, end quote. If we take a look at what those 2 executive orders say, Executive Order 13526 sets the rules for classifying information. It says when information can be classified, and it lays out rules against misuse of classification. For instance, it says you can't just, classify information just to cover up a mistake. So the Pentagon is likely citing this executive order just to remind reporters that truly classified information is off limits under the law, and leaking it could have serious consequences. Executive Order 13556 created a government-wide system for handling unclassified but still sensitive information. And this information is called CUI. It stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. CUI includes things like personally identifiable information, law enforcement data, critical infrastructure details, some military operational information, things of that nature. So while CUI isn't classified, agencies can still restrict this type of information and how it's shared. The Pentagon is therefore likely citing to this executive order to say that CUI should be treated the same as classified information and requiring pre-approval before release, even though by definition CUI is unclassified. And then finally, the Atomic Energy Act specifically covers restricted data and formally restricted data related to the use of nuclear weapons or the production of nuclear material. So if any military reporting touches on nuclear weapons, production of nuclear material, etc., the Atomic Energy Act makes it automatically protected. So by citing these 3 authorities, the Pentagon is basically saying, 1, we already have the authority to restrict classified information. 2, we also have the authority to restrict unclassified but sensitive information. And 3, we have statutory authority over restricted nuclear information. And they're citing to these things to justify requiring requiring approval of information before it's published by the press. However, the Pentagon then stretches this into sort of a blanket rule by requiring all information to get pre-approval before release, even if the information is unclassified and, not otherwise CUI. And none of these authorities that are cited to in the memo give the Pentagon the ability to require pre-approval for all information. In fact, the Supreme Court has kind of said the opposite. So let's talk about the First Amendment. Critics of this new policy argue that it violates the First Amendment's freedom of the press, specifically regarding the concept of prior restraint. For context, prior restraint refers to government actions that prevent speech or publication before it occurs. So in 1971, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called New York Times Company versus United States, also known as the Pentagon Papers case. And what the court said in this case is that the government could not prevent the New York Times and Washington Post from publishing classified documents about the Vietnam War. The court made clear that prior restraint, meaning government orders preventing the publication of defense materials, are presumed to be unconstitutional. And the court said the government bears a very high burden to justify prior restraint. It's not enough that the government makes generalized claims about national security. Instead, the government has to show that prior restraint is necessary to prevent direct, immediate, and irreparable harm to national security. If the government can show that a restriction on the publication of certain information is necessary to prevent direct, immediate, and irreparable harm to national security, then the government can presumably prevent the publication of this material, of that material. So if this new Pentagon policy were to be challenged, the constitutionality of it will hinge on whether the publication of certain news directly and inevitably imperils the safety of American forces. If it does, the Pentagon can likely prevent its publication. If it doesn't, this new policy runs afoul of the First Amendment. Now, when we go back to what this policy actually says, right, it says that the press has to take an oath that they will only publish government-approved information regardless of what that information is. Otherwise, they lose access to the Pentagon. This seems more like a blanket prior restraint that runs afoul of the First Amendment. Remember, per existing precedent, the government can only prevent publication of information if it can show that the particular information being published would cause direct, immediate, and irreparable harm to national security. In this case, they're basically just saying it doesn't matter what the information is, we tell you when you can publish it. And then finally, just to quickly touch on the arguments from both sides, supporters of the policy argue that it's necessary for reducing leaks and safeguarding national security, whereas opponents see this as government overreach, which undermines journalistic independence and transparency. So we'll likely see this policy get challenged, and once more develops there, I will, of course, fill you in. Yesterday, the president announced that the FDA would be notifying doctors that the use of Tylenol during pregnancy can be associated with a, quote, very increased risk of autism, end quote. In making the announcement, President Trump said, quote, I've been waiting for this meeting for 20 years, actually, and it's not that everything is 100% understood or known, but I think we've made a lot of strides. First, effective immediately, the FDA will be notifying physicians at the use of acetaminophen, which is basically commonly known as Tylenol, during pregnancy can be associated with a very increased risk of autism. For this reason, they are strongly recommending that women limit Tylenol use during pregnancy unless medically necessary. For instance, in cases of extremely high fever that you feel you can't tough it out, you can do it. I guess there's that. In other words, a fever that's very, very dangerous and ideally a doctor's decision, because I think you shouldn't take it at all. All pregnant women should talk to their doctors for more information about limiting the use of this medication while pregnant. End quote. The FDA press release similarly reads, quote, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration today initiated the process for a label change for acetaminophen, which is Tylenol and similar products, to reflect evidence suggesting that the use of acetaminophen by pregnant women may be associated with an increased risk of neurological conditions such as autism and ADHD in children. The agency also issued a related letter alerting physicians nationwide. Evidence in recent years has suggested a correlation between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and subsequent diagnosis of conditions like autism and ADHD. Multiple large-scale cohort studies, including the Nurses' Health Study 2 and the Boston Birth Cohort, find this association. Some studies have described that the risk may be most pronounced when acetaminophen is taken chronically throughout pregnancy. It is important to note that while an association between acetaminophen and neurological conditions has been described in many studies, a causal relationship has not been established, and there are contrary studies in the scientific literature. It is also noted that acetaminophen is the only over-the-counter drug approved for use to treat fevers during pregnancy, and high fevers in pregnant women can pose a risk to their children. Additionally, aspirin and ibuprofen have well-documented adverse impacts on the fetus. End quote. So that's what President Trump and the FDA have said. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about what we know. So the administration has received a lot of pushback, also a lot of praise for its decision. It really just depends on who it's coming from. So there's obviously plenty to talk about here. And by the way, just to be clear, make sure you listen, because I know some people kind of zone out here and there in the episodes, and they ask me why I didn't do something or why I didn't say something. And I'm like, actually, I did. Just go back and listen to this timestamp. And then they do. And they're like, oh, I must have zoned out. Okay, so I just want to be clear. Today's discussion will focus only on the potential link between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and neurological disorders. I know the president also spoke about vaccines and autism rates during his announcement, but I am keeping this segment narrowed to acetaminophen because that's where most of your questions have been. And honestly, the topic is detailed enough on its own without adding anything else in. So first and foremost, when it comes to studies, there is a difference, and this is all scientific studies, okay? There is a difference between causation and association. That is why the FDA's press release says, quote, "It is important to note that while an association between acetaminophen and neurological conditions has been described in many studies, a causal relationship has not been established." So association means that two things are observed to occur together more often than by chance, okay? So for example, people who drink more coffee are observed to also have higher rates of insomnia. However, an association does not mean one causes the other. It does not mean coffee causes insomnia. It could be a coincidence, or there could be a third thing that caused both of the first two. That's called a confounder. Causation is different. Causation means that evidence shows that one factor directly influences or brings about the other. Smoking causes lung cancer. That's causation. To prove causation, researchers need stronger evidence than just association. Causation is typically proven through controlled experiments where causation is tested directly, biological reasoning where, they're looking at how something works in the body, or through consistent studies that see the same findings across different studies in different places with different groups of people. As a general rule, every causal relationship shows association, but not every association shows causation. So we'll go through a couple of examples unrelated to Tylenol and autism just to get the concept down. Let's say studies show that when ice cream sales go up, drownings also go up. But ice cream doesn't cause drowning. Both are linked to hot weather in the summer. This is association, but it's not causation. So ice cream sales going up and drownings going up are associated, but one does not cause the other. Let's say people who drink coffee might also make more money. While coffee doesn't necessarily make you rich, otherwise I would be loaded, busy and successful professionals might just drink more coffee. Again, association, but not causation. On the other hand, decades of study proved that smoking actually damages lung tissue and causes cancer. This is not just a coincidence. This is not just an association. This is causation. Similarly, decades of medical research, clinical trials, and biological understanding shows us that high blood pressure causes increased risk of stroke. When blood pressure is too high, it damages arteries and increases the likelihood of clots or vessel ruptures, which directly leads to strokes. This isn't just an association, this is causation. So now that we understand the difference between the two, I want to be clear that the FDA is acknowledging that a causal relationship between Tylenol and autism has not been established. Rather, the FDA is highlighting certain studies that have found an association between Tylenol and neurological conditions, including autism, meaning women taking Tylenol while pregnant and their babies having neurological conditions later on have been observed together, but that doesn't mean taking Tylenol while pregnant causes those neurological conditions. The neurological conditions could be coincidence. They could be influenced by some other third factor like genetics, environment. Causation has not been proven. So I think this is a good place to kind of stop for a second, digest what we just, learned. We'll take our second and final break here. When we come back, we'll go through the science. So we'll talk about the studies that the FDA cites in support of its announcement, and then also a study that kind of contradicts those findings. Welcome back. Before we took a break, we discussed the difference between causation and association. Now what we'll do is go through some of the studies that have been done and what they've found. Am I going to cite every single study on the subject matter? No, but I will cite a few. And I'll warn you that we are about to get into science and numbers, so if you're distracted while listening to this, it might be better to come back to this specific part of the episode when you can fully focus, because it'll be really easy to get lost or miss crucial details. We'll first go through the 2 studies cited in the FDA's press release, and then a third study not cited in the FDA's press release that contradicts the association findings through sibling analysis. So the first study cited in the press release is a study that was funded by the National Institute of Health. It was published in 2019. It's titled Use of Negative Control Exposure Analysis to Evaluate Confounding, an example of acetaminophen exposure and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in Nurses' Health Study 2. The study found that regular maternal use of acetaminophen in pregnancy has been linked to ADHD in children, but concerns regarding uncontrolled confounding remain even after the study. So researchers looked at whether moms taking acetaminophen, Tylenol, was linked to ADHD in their kids. Okay, so this study was specifically looking at ADHD, not autism. And they studied about 8,800 children born between 1993 and 2005. Moms were to fill out regular health surveys, which included a question about how often they used acetaminophen. So regular use was defined as 2 times or more each week in the earlier years of the study. And then the definition of regular use actually changed in the later years of the study to 1 day each week or more. About 8% of the 8,800 kids involved in the study were later diagnosed with ADHD. The study found that only acetaminophen use during pregnancy was linked to a higher chance of ADHD in children, about a 34% higher risk. Using acetaminophen before pregnancy or after pregnancy did not show any link to ADHD, just during pregnancy. The study says that these results support earlier studies suggesting that taking acetaminophen while pregnant could affect a child's brain development, but that just taking it at other times doesn't show the same risk. The study could not completely rule out things that change during pregnancy that could also affect ADHD risk, like sickness, fever, pain, or other reasons that one might take acetaminophen. The study also does not have detailed data on exact timing during pregnancy, like which trimester it was taken in, or detailed data on dose or frequency beyond just regular use. And again, that study looked at the correlation between acetaminophen use and ADHD, not autism. So that's one study. The other study that the FDA cites is another one funded by the NIH, published in 2020, titled Association of Cord Plasma Biomarkers of In Utero Acetaminophen Exposure with Risk of ADHD and Autism Spectrum Disorder in Childhood. In this study, researchers wanted to see if babies exposed to Tylenol in utero had a higher chance of developing ADHD or autism. Instead of just asking moms if they took Tylenol, like the last study did, the scientists actually measured acetaminophen levels in umbilical cord blood samples from about 996 babies that were born at Boston Medical Center between 1998 and 2018. When those kids were followed up later, about 1 in 4 had ADHD and about 1 in 15 had autism. Some had both. The researchers found that the higher the acetaminophen levels in cord blood, the greater the risk of ADHD or autism. For example, kids in the middle group of acetaminophen exposure were about 2 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than kids in the lowest group. Kids in the highest group were about 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or autism compared to the lowest group. In other words, the study found a dose-response relationship. The more acetaminophen detected in the baby's cord blood, the higher the odds of ADHD or autism. And those associations held up even when adjusting for potential confounding variables like maternal age, race, education, stress, smoking, environment, etc. So the researchers concluded that these findings support earlier concerns about Tylenol use in pregnancy, and suggest more research is needed. Again, the study has limitations. So one limitation is that the cord blood was only measured once at birth. So it only reflects exposure around delivery time, not necessarily throughout the whole pregnancy. 2, because acetaminophen was detectable in everyone, there wasn't a completely non-exposed group to compare to. And 3, as merely an observational study, it didn't take into account other factors like genetic factors and environmental factors that can influence both acetaminophen exposure and risk of neurodevelopmental disorders. So those were the 2 studies cited in the FDA's press release. Overall, they provide evidence that higher fetal exposure to acetaminophen is associated with an increased risk of ADHD and autism in children, but neither proves that acetaminophen causes those outcomes. And both studies acknowledged that more research, especially research that tracks exposure from early pregnancies, different doses, timing, etc., is still needed. Now, this last study was published by the JAMA Network last year, and it's titled Acetaminophen Use During Pregnancy and Children's Risk of Autism, ADHD, and Intellectual Disability. Again, researchers wanted to see if there's a link between using acetaminophen during pregnancy and later neurodevelopmental issues in kids, specifically autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability. They used a large Swedish national dataset covering just under 2.5 million children born between 1995 and 2019, with follow-up until the end of 2021. This is the largest study to date analyzing a possible link between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and autism. For this study, they collected acetaminophen use data from pregnancy records and prescription databases. But most importantly, the study also did a sibling control analysis. And through this analysis, they compared siblings born to the same parent where one pregnancy involved acetaminophen use and another did not. This was done to help control for, shared family, genetic, environmental factors. The study found that children exposed to acetaminophen during pregnancy had slightly higher risks of autism, ADHD, and intellectual disability compared to unexposed children. For example, for ADHD, there was about a 7% higher risk. For autism, there was a 6% higher risk compared to unexposed kids. However, when comparing siblings, these associations disappeared. The sibling analysis found no significant increased risk of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability linked to acetaminophen use. And in the sibling analysis, there was no dose response pattern, meaning higher acetaminophen doses did not translate to higher risk among siblings. Now, of course, that study has limitations too. The study can't perfectly measure actual use, right? How much was taken, when it was taken, at what point during pregnancy was it taken, especially when it comes to over-the-counter acetaminophen. Prescription data captures only part of its use. Diagnoses for ADHD and intellectual disability weren't validated in all the cases. And the sibling analysis also has limits. For example, if the parent's behavior or health changed between pregnancies, that could also affect results. So this study suggests that while pregnant people who use acetaminophen seem to have children with a slightly higher risk of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability, the sibling analysis strongly indicates no causal effect. Meaning, once you account for family genetic environmental similarity by comparing the siblings, the increased risk of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability disappears. And it's also important to keep in mind that this is the largest study to date and one of the only studies that have done a sibling comparison. So overall, if we take all of these studies together, there are a few key things that we can take away here. Number one, some studies do show an association between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and neurological conditions like autism and ADHD, but association does not equal causation. Number two, no study has ever confirmed that acetaminophen use causes these disorders. Number three, when genetics and family factors are accounted for, the link weakens or disappears. Number four, all research so far agrees that more studies are needed before anyone can say whether acetaminophen use in pregnancy causes autism or ADHD. It's also important to note that acetaminophen is currently the only over-the-counter pain reliever and fever reducer considered generally safe during pregnancy. Pregnant women are advised to avoid aspirin and ibuprofen because of well-documented risks to the fetus, those risks being miscarriage, bleeding, fetal kidney issues, complications during pregnancy. The list goes on. At the same time, untreated high fevers during pregnancy can themselves pose serious risks. Things like neural tube defects, miscarriage, even stillbirth. So that's why, despite ongoing studies about associations and studies existing that show associations, doctors still recommend acetaminophen in cases where it's medically necessary, especially for reducing fevers, because based on the evidence we currently have, untreated fevers during pregnancy pose far greater risks than acetaminophen itself. That is what we know based on the evidence we have. So I hope that discussion clears up all or at least most of your questions and leaves you feeling more confident in knowing what the actual data says. Okay, let's do some quick hitters. We're just going to do a few today, starting with the Secret Service dismantling a large telecommunications network in the New York tri-state area that officials say could have shut down wireless communications across New York and potentially even threatened the UN General Assembly meetings this week. Agents discovered 300 SIM servers and more than 100,000 SIM cards capable of sending up to 30 million text messages per minute. These quote-unquote SIM farms were hidden in abandoned apartment buildings across at least 5 locations. According to investigators, the servers were so powerful, they could have disrupted cell towers and potentially blocked emergency communications. Authorities believe the network was being used by foreign perpetrators to send encrypted messages to organized crime groups, cartels, and terrorist organizations. But for now, officials have not disclosed which government or groups might have been behind it. And President Trump spoke at the UN General Assembly meeting this morning, criticizing the UN while praising the work of his administration. Trump said the U.S. has the strongest borders, military, and relationships around the world, while accusing the UN of not living up to its full potential. He said, quote, "For the most part, at least for now, all they," meaning the UN, "seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action," end quote. He also said, quote, "Everyone says that I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for each one of these achievements, but for me, the real prize will be the sons and daughters who lived to grow up with their mothers and fathers because millions of people are no longer being killed in endless and inglorious wars," end quote. And the Supreme Court says President Trump can proceed with firing the FTC commissioner for now and will hear arguments in the case in December. When the case goes before the justices in December, they will reconsider a 1935 Supreme Court decision that held that presidents cannot remove independent agency heads without cause if Congress has required cause for their removal. The court will decide whether to uphold or overturn that precedent. For today's Critical Thinking segment, you already know we're going to revisit the acetaminophen autism announcement and discussion. I'll pose some questions for those of you who support the administration's recent announcement, those of you that oppose it, and those who are undecided. The first one is for supporters. If no study has yet proven that acetaminophen causes autism or ADHD, should the FDA be taking action now based on associations alone? What are the risks? I want you to think through the risks of acting too soon versus waiting for stronger evidence. And if you believe that action is justified on associations alone, should the FDA issue similar warnings for other medications or exposures where studies show associations but not causation, like caffeine or certain chemicals? If not, why? What's your rationale for singling out acetaminophen? Now, here are a couple of questions for opponents of the announcement. Even if causation hasn't been proven, if multiple studies show potential risk, however small, don't public health agencies at least have a duty to warn the public so people can make informed choices? Or should they stay silent until causation is certain? And if you think the government should stay silent until causation is proven, what happens if years down the road causation is confirmed? Would the public accuse agencies of hiding information? Should those agencies have to bear the responsibility for any harm done to its citizens? What happens in that case? And for those of you who are undecided, or I guess these questions could really be for anyone, how should agencies communicate science that's still unsettled without either panicking the public or appearing to downplay real concerns? What's the most responsible course of action for the administration here? That's what I have for you today. I hope you have a fantastic next couple of days. I will be back with you on Thursday, which is only 2 days away at this point. So I will talk to you soon.